Good day, everyone. My name is Reza and today I'm going to be presenting to you on South African labor market dynamics in the first quarter of the COVID-19 lockdowns. I am presenting this work. It's part of a paper that I co-authored with my friend and colleague, Wim Ranchard, and that paper is available online at the cramsurvey.org website. Our findings are based on the National Income Dynamics Study, Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, which you can access at the URL cramsurvey.org. The characteristics of the NIDS-CRAM sample are stemmed from the sampling frame of the National Income Dynamics Study, or NIDS, which was an existing panel study of started in 2008, and it continued over 5 waves to 2017. And that particular study was the sampling frame that we used to draw a sample for NIDS-CRAM. In NIDS-CRAM, we shifted from a face-to-face survey in NIDS to a telephonic interview survey in NIDS-CRAM. Wave 1 was conducted between 7th of May and the 27th of June 2020 among a sample of 7,073 adults aged 18 years and older. NIDS-CRAM Wave 2 consisted of 5,676 of these individuals who were successfully re-interviewed between the 13th of July and the 13th of August, leading to a response rate of 80%. And the NIDS-CRAM survey continues for 5 waves. We included a top-up sample in Wave 3, but the focus of this particular paper is what happened between Waves 1 and Waves 2, which are in the strictest levels of lockdown in South Africa at the time. Right, so this describes the level of lockdown, which is quite crucial to understand if you want to map that through to employment dynamics. Wave 1 of the survey focused on measuring employment outcomes for February 2020, which was a pre-COVID baseline, and then April 2020, which was during the first full month of South Africa's strictest lockdown phase, which was called level 5. During this level, which was in place from 27th of March to 30th of April, almost all activity was suspended, except for the production of essential goods and services, mainly in the food, medical and security sectors, and workers were encouraged to work from home where possible. All schools, early childhood development centers and childcare facilities were closed, and domestic workers and childminders were not allowed to go to work unless they were living with their employers at the time. In Wave 2 of NIDS-CRAM, the focus was on measuring employment outcomes for June 2020, when South Africa was in a less restrictive lockdown phase called Level 3. This ran from 1 June to 17 August 2020. And while there was very little difference in the level of economic activity allowed under Level 5 and Level 4, the move to Level 3 meant that many businesses were allowed to reopen for the first time since the 27th of March 2020. Instead of specifying which sectors could operate, as had previously been the case, the government transitioned to listing which sectors could not reopen under Level 3. We then saw restrictions that included personal care services, if social distancing was not possible, all on-site consumption of food and alcohol in restaurants and bars until alcohol was banned for hotels and accommodation for leisure, international and domestic air travel, except for essential work, conferences, events and gatherings, entertainment venues and fitness centers. On the childcare side, in addition to domestic workers and childminders being allowed to return to work, grade 7 and grade 12 were allowed to go back to school at the beginning of June. Childcare work in households with children may have lessened somewhat. However, ECD centers and most school grades remain closed in June. So when we're talking about the employment effects, we're really talking about what happened between pre-COVID in February and what happened in June. What I've done in this graph is I've indexed the employment on the pre-COVID lockdown or pre-COVID baseline of February in NIDS-CRAM, and I've compared that also with Statistics South Africa's quarterly labor force survey for quarter 1. The two surveys mirror each other up until October 2020, but of course our focus is in this initial phase of lockdown. I'll talk briefly about these results, but they will give insights into a different period of time that we're focusing on here. So initially, we can see that in NIDS-CRAM, which is the amber line, we see a loss in employment of approximately 16.6%. And that shows us that that initial lockdown was fairly harsh indeed. Slightly lower percentages when we're talking about Statistics South Africa's benchmarks. And then in NIDS-CRAM, by the time we get to June, which is at lockdown level 3, we see a somewhat of a recovery by just about 1.9%, moving to 85.3 and 89.1 compared to 86 with Statistics South Africa's employment levels. So what we're going to look at is really just this window of opportunity here, because what we're closely mapping to are the regulations associated with lockdown. After this period of June, in the third and fourth quarters of South Africa, the NIDS-CRAM and Statistics South Africa surveys diverged somewhat, and we've just gotten recent estimates of wave 4 of NIDS-CRAM, which show again a movement away from what was lockdown level 1 in the fourth quarter of NIDS-CRAM and of 2020 through to the first quarter of 2021. But our focus is really around how these lockdown regulations affected employment outcomes. Okay, so what was happening to GDP during this time? Of course, with restrictions such as strict lockdowns, we saw a big reduction in GDP. The estimate was that approximately 16.4% reduction in GDP between the first and second quarters of 2020. In the labor force survey, we saw that that roughly translated into about 2.2 million jobs lost between Q1 and Q2. And in NIDS-CRAM, our estimate was that we saw 2.8 million jobs lost between February and April, which was our equivalent to the Stats SS Q1 and Q2. So the same broad movements, higher numbers in NIDS-CRAM, of course, but that's because it's a somewhat different survey. So the overall changes in levels of employment and unemployment between 18 to 59-year-olds are as follows. We can see that in April, we had approximately 49% employment, and that's an employment rate in the 18 to 59-year-old age group. We had searching unemployment of 14.29, non-searching of 22.34, and not economically active was 14.31. Our narrow and broad unemployment rates were 22.56% and 42.75%. In June, that changed somewhat. We saw our employment rates didn't go up too much, but what happened was a big jump in our unemployment searching, narrow, from 22 to 26, and our broad unemployment rate stayed roughly the same. So if we split up, even though there wasn't these big movements in our actual employment rates, if we look at what happened in the employment to population ratio, we can see considerable variation over different education levels, different age groups, and of course, different races. The first thing to focus on is that the overall levels here of employment movements, including furloughed workers, was a drop from 57% in the EPOP, that's the employment to population ratio, pre-COVID in Feb, down to 48% in April, and up to 49%, so only 1 percentage point in June. Now, that was very different across the sectors. We can see that for those people who did not have a secondary school matriculant qualification, their level of furloughed stayed the same, their levels of unemployment stayed the same. There was not a big recovery. Similarly, for the traditional sector, we saw an even lower decline in that employment rate. On the other hand, for youth, we saw at 1 percentage point increase, mirroring what happened at the national level. On the other hand, for those people who were matriculants, and they saw that their employment rates remained roughly the same, just about 1 percentage point increase. Similarly, those with prime-aged adults, men saw a continued reduction in women in what was happening to their employment rate, while women saw an increase by 2 percentage points. Between the races in South Africa is always important to look because they mirror class so well. We can see a big return to employment among white people. We saw among colored people a similar magnitude, whereas among Black South Africans, that stayed relatively constant. And that mirrors what is going on amongst where people are employed, which particular occupations in particular. Here, when we start looking at the non-furloughed workers between April and June by occupation, we start seeing that in almost every one of these occupations, we see an increase in the level of non-furloughed workers that are employed. So all occupations gained during this time. And the reason for this is partly due to the relaxation of those lockdown restrictions. In terms of employment transition, so this is where we keep the panel component of the survey, and we restrict the sample to only those individuals who answered the questions both in wave 1 and wave 2. Remember, there are 3 points. There's the pre-COVID baseline of February, there's the first lockdown level 5 and employment outcomes in April, and then there's the second wave of NIDS-CRAM, which looked at June. So if we create that balanced panel sample and analyze the transitions over time, we see that between February and April, only 60.9% of workers remained employed. 13.5% of them were put into some state of furloughed work. That's where you're employed, but either are not getting paid or alternatively are getting paid a reduced salary, while 25.6% of people lost their jobs. On the other hand, between April and June, we can see that roughly 76.9% of people kept their jobs, 4.8% went back into a state of furloughed, whereas 18.3% of people lost their jobs. On the other hand, amongst those who were furloughed in the first transition from February to April, 62% remained in a state of furloughed employment, 13% went back to work, whereas 24.6% lost their jobs again. So fairly dire circumstances, despite the fact that our lockdown regulations were relaxed substantially. So overall, by the time we got to June, we knew that we were in a state of lockdown. The lockdown regulations were relaxed. There was a slight increase in the level of employment relative to the stage 5 lockdown. But overall, there was no recovery in that labor market. And this was something that caused a lot of instability in the South African labor market. It began to be defined by considerable amounts of churning. Workers that were transitioning out of the state of being furloughed due to the changes in lockdown level 5 to level 3 was perhaps one of the most important findings, because what that allowed people to do was get back to work. So the restrictions in movement, the restrictions in being able to work in personal care and services sectors, that allowed people to actually get back to work and was the single most important component of the relaxation of our lockdown levels. Now, the major finding, which is that this level of labor market churning is what has defined the COVID-19 period, not only in South Africa, but around the world, calls great attention to more specific geographical levels of lockdown differences. In other words, lockdown regulations are going to have to start being far more locationally specific, down to the sort of metropolitan level. And the reason that we say that is because of the fact that that's going to restrict the negative repercussions of moving into and sort of very strict lockdown regulations, which we saw in this lockdown level 5. If we are talking about the long-term health of economies, these very strong shocks to the economy are going to have to be mediated through better information, through better targeting, and that's the message we would like to leave at the end of this paper. Thank you.